Jasper, Indiana, and an architect. And so Ron's going to be reporting on the German landmark preservation in Du Bois County, and Jasper is the county seat of Du Bois County. We'll take a break in July, no program, but in August we'll come back with the Liederkranz brass band. it'll be their encore performance, and this will be held at the Stammtisch will be live also in German Park. German Park is on the far south side of Indianapolis on South Meridian. In September, we'll have student presentations from a variety of student projects and essay writing contests, including the findings of an honor student of mine at IUPUI, talking about exploring the German language newspaper, the Indiana Tribune, and articles related to Das Deutsche Haus. Mm-hmm. And then we have Norbert Kropf in October 13th, and he is the poet, the former poet laureate of Indiana. And Norbert is also from Jasper, Indiana, the native of Du Bois County. On November 10th, we'll be meeting in German Park, and our board member, Travis Yerde, will be helping us sort this out. German Park, German American Club, and then the Indianapolis Federation of German Societies. And it's all intertwined. And so he's going to moderate a group discussion about that and figuring out all those different aspects. In December 8th for the Stammtisch, it will be our annual Weihnachtsliederkranz und Christbaum Schmuck Austausch.
A nice long German word.
And it's all one word.
Yes.
And that will either be at the Athenaeum or will be remotely in Carmel at the Christkindlmarkt. And Indiana German Heritage Society is actively participating in the Christkindlmarkt for the last several years. And so we'll get together and sing the best Christmas songs ever. And also, if you want to bring a Christmas ornament wrapped of $5 to $10 in value, bring it in and put it in the big basket. And then before you leave, you take another one to go home with you. So that's our programs for the rest of the year. And again, please join Indiana German Heritage Society. Now, on to the speaker, on to our program tonight. It is my honor to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, who is Frau Dr. Professor Gabriela Robinson. She is Professor Emerita of Indiana University at South Bend in English literature. She is the author of 6 books, including German Settlers of South Bend, which is both in German edition and an English edition, and also A Life in Letters, a 19th century correspondence between Bavaria and South Bend. Now, she is not from South Bend. She lives there now, but she was born in Berlin and earned degrees at Columbia University in New York, as well as the University of London for a PhD, and taught English literature at IU South Bend for many years. Topic tonight is her 2020 memoir, Appie's Berlin Diaries, my quest to understand my grandfather's Nazi past. Now, Gabriela had the good fortune to have primary sources. It was her grandfather's, written in his own hand, her grandfather's diaries to read, digest, and reflect upon, and that's what we'll hear. So the book has won high praise. It was awarded the silver medal from the Nautilus Better Books for a Better World, and also a finalist for the Montaigne Medal, a finalist from the Erich Hofer Award. And the quote from that is, what that's about is, to the most thought-provoking books. These are books that either illuminate, progress, or redirect thought. Now that's very profound. And that is how they are describing her book, which she will discuss with us. So with not taking up or wasting any more time, I want to turn it over to Frau Dr. Professor Gabriela Robinson.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here. And I'm saying cheers to everyone. Since this is a Stammtisch, Stammtisch needs some beer. I am really looking forward to hearing from you all. So I will, give a little introduction about how I came to write the book and some of the main topics that it's about. But then I do hope to hear from you. I'm rarely in such a knowledgeable group of German people, interested in things German and knowledgeable about German. I want to say, Ruth, I was happy to just get a quick glimpse of you when you were on video. I haven't seen you in a long time, and I'm glad to see you looking well. I don't know many of the other people here, but I hope to hear from you all. So also, if the question comes up as I'm talking, please put it in the chat. And Janet and Travis have kindly agreed to look at the chat and monitor it. And if something is appropriate right then, to just, chime in right then when we are talking about something you are asking. Yes, Apis Berlin Diaries was my most difficult book to write. And there's two moments in the early process of getting started that still always stick out to me. The first one is that after my mother's death, my husband Mike and I went to Vienna into her Vienna apartment. And after we had come back from a long walk, I just wanted to read a book before going to bed. And I'm a great Theodor Fontane fan. And I saw Effie Briest on a bookshelf high up. I had to climb on a chair to get it down. And as I pulled it out, these two little green notebooks fell out along with it. As I opened them, I immediately recognized my grandfather's handwriting. He had always written poems for me to recite on special occasions, and he had helped me with my Latin. And so I was very familiar with his handwriting. So I sat down right away to read it. I suddenly wasn't tired anymore. And I saw that these were daily entries in Berlin, 1945, where he worked as doctor. Each entry begins and ends with sort of prayers to us that we had survived. My mother, grandmother, and I had fled Berlin in 1945 February, when we lost our apartment to bombs. But he had stayed behind because as doctor he was needed. So the rest of each entry is really taken up with pretty traumatic circumstances. The medical bunkers didn't have water and hardly any light except tallow candles. There was blood everywhere. The wounded and dying were just lying on the bare cement floor, and the dead were simply stacked outside. And the streets were covered in rubble. Although my grandfather always lived right there in the center near the Reichstag, he could hardly recognize where he was or orient himself. He had to make his way through, bits of houses that were still left standing and over mounds of rubble. And the smoke that filled the air just, he said, made it hard to breathe. And then there were, of course, already by that time, millions of refugees from the East fleeing before the Soviet army, who were living in the streets and dying in the streets. So I wanted to, as I read more, I thought, I take this home and I would like to make, have this as a document, eyewitness document, another eyewitness document of what life was like for an ordinary citizen in Berlin in 1945. And then when I took it home and looked more closely, I kept seeing two letters, but didn't at first pay a whole lot of attention. The two letters were P and G. Maybe some of you would have caught on before, but I I didn't at first. I was so overwhelmed by what I was reading. But then I still remember that moment. It dawned on me. PG meant Parteigenosse, member of the party. And then I realized that my grandfather had been a member of the Nazi party. This had never been mentioned in my family. Altogether, I grew up in post World War II Germany. And although I got an excellent education there, we never learned anything about the Nazi period. In fact, history classes ended with the end of World War One. And it wasn't talked about in my family or wasn't talked about in public. And neither I nor, as far as I remember, any of my friends ever questioned that. We just, went along with this. We didn't really think, we hadn't experienced any of the Nazi period consciously. And so we didn't, I went around thinking of what I wanted to do. I wanted to, do something with modern drama. And I was, focused on all that and really did not pay any attention. So now when I found this out, my first reaction was to just hide the diaries again, actually, just as my mother had done. I did not want to expose the grandfather I loved who had given me my first stable home. And I just didn't even talk to Mike about it. I just shut up again and, in a way, continued the silence. But eventually, it was actually, strangely enough, an American book. I was working on a book about African American housing segregation. And for background, I was reading Edward Ball's book called Slaves in the Family. I don't know whether any of you are familiar with that. And in that, he says that when he told his family that he was going to talk about or write a book about the slaves his family kept, they were outraged. One of them screamed at him, "You're going to dig up our grandfather and hang him." And I could totally sympathize with that. And he too said it gave him pause. But then he decided, no, he may not have been responsible for what his grandparents did, but he was accountable. And that somehow just hit home to me. We are accountable for our country's past. And strangely, these days, young folks, especially these young podcasters who, write about books and have written about my book, that is one of the things that they single out, that it shows the necessity to confront your country's past, and to face your past and your history. So I decided I needed to write about this. And the book underwent lots of changes, but eventually it became sort of 4 topics that I switched back and forth between in a huge number, 62, but very short chapters. One, and the main one, is my grandfather's experiences as doctor in Berlin, 1945. First, during the fall of Berlin, and then during the Soviet occupation, since he was in the center where the Soviets were. Of course, at first the Soviets were everywhere, that the Allies didn't come till much later. And he's describing all that was happening there, both in terms of health, but also just in general living conditions. And the second part is retracing my grandfather's steps in the Berlin of the 21st century, trying to find out why he had joined the Nazi party, trying to find out, see where he went, and what, to kind of get a better sense and background what it was like. And this was between 2008 and 2012. And at that time, it was amazing that the former East Germany, there were still so many signs of of the war. In fact, right where he was, there were streets that were just, fallen down houses, empty, grass-grown areas, bullet holes in the buildings, and so on. Although Unter den Linden was already a pretty fancy shopping and tourist area, just one street over, it was still pretty desolate. And another part was I also went and did some research in the archives, and I was amazed, despite war and bombs and fires and so on, how much survived. In the university archives, I found 3 volumes, thick volumes of documents on my grandfather, because he worked at the Charité hospital for a while, and he got his doctorate at the university there. There was a lot of information about his service in World War One. He wanted to be an ophthalmologist, but his family did not have the money to send him to this very august institution in Berlin. And so he applied for a scholarship. It was a military academy. And they accepted him, and the condition was that for every semester that he got free, totally free, he had to serve 1 year as military doctor. And he was so excited to be part of this this military academy, which was part of the Charité under later on Sauerbruch, and my grandfather worked under Sauerbruch, and the university, Humboldt University. And so he gladly agreed to that. But as his ill luck would have it, he graduated with his degree in 1914. So he was in the First World War from beginning to end. And I found out that another thing that had never been mentioned, that early in the war, he was served on the Eastern Front as doctor, and which was pretty brutal. And early on, he had a nervous breakdown, and he was actually a patient sent back to the Charité as a patient that he had just graduated from recently before. And that was also something I discovered through that. And I found out many explanations of why he may have joined, and I go into this in a moment. But really, I did not come up with one, big answer about this. And then throughout, I'm also talking about my grandfather also brings back all the memories of living with him when he had given me my first stable home. After we were refugees, I was moved around a lot. I was in Vienna for a while. I was in a convent boarding school. I lived with relatives and so on. And until I lived with him, I didn't really have a stable home. And really the happiest years of my childhood, just maybe one story to sort of see that he always, when it got windy in the fall, he said, we need to build a kite. And he showed me, we went into the basement and he showed me how to build a kite, and I got to do the tail. And in German, we call a kite a Drachen. So I painted the Drachen face. And on one of these occasions, we went out and it was particularly windy, and he ran with the kite flying high when a patient of his waved to him and said hello. So he looked up and waved back, and then he was gone. And when I rushed to see what had happened, I saw him sitting in a ditch. Northern Germany is a very moist country, and the meadows, which were across from our house, all have drainage ditches running through them. And he sat there and he laughed. He was still holding on to the kite, and I jumped there in with him, and we both laughed and looked up as the kite dancing up high. And so it was a wonderful childhood. He was also very intent on my education, but he made everything enjoyable and fun. And then the last part, of course, is questions about German guilt which then really morphed also into questions of all our political responsibility. I was sort of haunted by Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote from letter from Birmingham jail. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but where he says that we have to repent not only the vicious deeds of the bad people, but the terrible silence of the good people. And of course, that kind of responsibility involves all of us. And I kept asking myself, too, what would I have done if I had lived at that time? How would I have dealt with it? You know, we all like to think that one would have been courageous and stood up defiantly and so on. But I very much doubt that I would have done that. You know, I would have done in a way what my grandfather did, sort of keeping his head down. After he joined the party, he wasn't active as far as I could see in it. But he had joined the party. So even though I don't come up with any kind of one clear answer, he fit the profile of the people. He joined in 1933, and he perfectly fit the profile of the people who joined then. They were older, they were conservative, and they were veterans of World War I and usually educated. In fact, so much so that after that May 1st event, Hitler closed the party for a while because he didn't want it to be overrun by these educated conservative folks that were joining at that time. The doctors were a group that particularly joined the party because the whole medical association was taken over by Hitler very early on. So there were lots of reasons I could come up with, but really no one complete answer. So what I would like the reader to come away with is, first of all, some understanding or empathy for my grandfather, who in Stefan Zweig's words, was a victim of the volcanic eruptions of the 20th century, serving in 2 world wars, that huge inflation, constant upheaval afterwards, after World War I, after the end of World War I, where gangs of Nazis fought gangs of communists, and the city was unsafe, there were assassinations and so on. It was just constant turmoil. So I would like them to have, some understanding of the impact of history on my grandfather's life. And then maybe also think about, for readers, to think about the impact of history on their own lives, because history plays a role in all our, whatever we are going through. I like the quote from William Faulkner, who says, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." The past is still with us all, and to kind of reflect, well, what is the role that my upbringing and my growing up and living in the time frame that I lived in. But then beyond that, I hope that the story will help to reinforce, to see how, no matter how different we are, from what different backgrounds, different cultures we come to, we have more that unites us than that divides us. And that we have to really embrace our common humanity and treat each other with compassion and tolerance in a way that whole COVID nightmare is also bringing this home to us, right? We're always seeing banners and so on. We're in this together. And I hope that this book in some way, in the broadest way, also reinforces that. A couple of things that, I don't know whether any people here are students or researchers or so. Research really has helped a lot too. It helped flesh out the background, things that were not mentioned in the diary and that I didn't know about, like books like Anthony Beevor's The Fall of Berlin, and diaries from other eyewitnesses and so on really helped enormously. And there's just one little episode that I got through research that still gives me almost goosebumps when I talk about it. And that is the Soviet journalist who had been covering Stalingrad, and then he came with Field Marshal Zhukov to Berlin, and he thought after what he had seen in Stalingrad, nothing would shock him anymore. But when he wandered around in the ruins of Berlin, he was shocked. And on one of his walks, he went to the zoo because he had remembered that the largest gorilla in Europe was housed there, and he wondered what had happened to her. And of course, he found the gorilla dead in her cage, just as almost all the other animals in the zoo had been killed. But then the zookeeper came up, and they got into a conversation. And at one point, the journalist asked, was she fierce? And the zookeeper responded, no, she just roared loudly. Humans are fiercer. And I thought that so stood for the whole experience that I am describing, and the war, and even what we have experienced beyond later on. Humans are fiercer. It almost became the title, but then it just became the heading of a chapter. And one other thing that happened in part through research was that out of the blue, I was contacted by a British magazine. It was a kind of magazine that deals with military history of World War I and II. And they, through my book, identified a plane crash. My father was an Austrian who, with the annexation, became part of the Luftwaffe. He was a fighter pilot, and he was shot down over England just a few months after I was born. And I always knew that, but I didn't really know the details. And they knew about that crash off the coast, but didn't know who the pilot was. And so the two things came together, and they sent me pictures actually of the plane crash and even an eyewitness report. The person was no longer alive, but he had written about how he saw the plane go down. They said that he made an almost perfect belly landing after he was hit, but then there was a little stream which had one side of the bank was higher than the other, and his wing caught in that and flipped the plane over. And as the guy rushed over there and first checked whether the pilot was still alive and saw that he wasn't, he then cut out pieces of the perspex, the plastic hoodie kind of thing, and made rings and brooches out of them. And in fact, they now offered me a sample, but I declined that. But it's amazing what can still be found out. And they were delighted to have, and I wrote then an article for that magazine to talk about my father a bit, because that was a hole they hadn't filled, they didn't know. Well, there would be so many other stories, but I think we, maybe would like to have some questions. Are there any questions in the chat, or would you like me to talk more?
If you would, could you continue maybe about another 10 minutes or so?
Okay. What aspect interests you most about the book? What would you like me to focus on?
Well, I hate to give you this answer, but all of it, everything.
Well, is there anything that would you be more interested in the writing process, or more interested in the details I found, or what is it you're most interested in about this?
Well, if you could touch on both of those, I think. So the process of writing and also pulling this all together, turning it into a book, and then the other one is more of those details that you dissected from his diary.
Okay, okay. Um, as to the first thing, for though I hope there are many people who are writers and who want to maybe write their own memoirs or their own tell their own family stories. I'm always very keen to help others do that, and I, now with Zoom, I'm doing it across the country. People who want to tell their stories, and it's not so much that I can help them do this, but if they, as long as they talk to me, things sort of clarify in their own minds. Um, and I always like Stephen King's phrase that I write to find out what I think. And that certainly was true of me. But the major revision, when I first when I first sent what I thought was the finished product off to my agent, it was 7 very long chronological chapters about my grandfather's life. And I got fascinated by, let me just have a drink here. I learned so much about the history. He was born in Prussia near Gdansk, and learning about the Teutonic Knights and how they fought the Prussians, which were actually Latvians by these were the people who lived there, and they were the Teutonic Knights were trying to take over, Germanize that part of the world, and the Prussians were fierce fighters, and they prided themselves on roasting the Teutonic Knights in their armor like chestnuts. But the Teutonic Knights were totally up to that too, and fierce, fear-inspiring folks. And they gave these Prussians, each group, the choice: either become Christian or we'll kill you all. And they won out for a while and built a castle there. And my grandfather would occasionally have talked about that, going to that castle, which had a kind of separate tower, which could be reached only by a high bridge. And that was the lavatory. That's how, gravity then took care. It was near the river, and gravity took care of the rest. So I got clearly sidetracked into all, sucked up into all these details about his life and his early life and his upbringing and so on. And my agent wrote back that she really liked it all, but I needed to put more of myself into the book. And I had never done this. In, being an academic and later on writing these histories, like the German settlers of South Bend, I'm dealing with other people's lives, but not with my own. So it really made me sit up and think. And that's when the book really took shape in a different way. I think that's when I really found my voice for it. And when I then started to juxtapose my grandfather's life with my life with him, and writing about that, that is one of the amazing things about writing, finding out what you think, but also finding out what you remember. For example, when I write about my grandfather's death, I started off by using all the kind of conventional things of grief and loss. I was 12 years old at the time. But then as I was writing, suddenly something came to me that I hadn't thought about in decades and decades. And that was after he had died, he had come home from visiting patients. He treated patients in an old folks home for free. And he came home and obviously knew he was having a heart attack. and just tried to reach his bed before collapsing and dropped his gloves at the bottom of the stairs going up to the bedroom. And there they were lying. And I remembered it. Suddenly it came back to me. I saw those for days because nobody took them away. And the fingers looked sort of rigid and dead. They were still bent from his hand. And somehow that became an image of his death for me. But I had not thought of that in so long. And that was true of other memories, happier memories with outings that we took together. When how he took me on the back of his bike when he was making house calls at first from the place where we were refugees, where we had gone, and then he joined us eventually when he could get out of Berlin. And there were only 1.5 rooms in that cottage, and there wasn't even running water. It's sort of hard to imagine that, you know, I'm old enough to have lived for a while in a place which had an outside pump and an outhouse. And we only had very little space. And so he visited the patients on his bike. And on nice days, I got to go with him, and he would tell me stories, and we would talk about the clouds, and were just wonderful experiences. So much of that came back to me in the process. And then it became this movement back and forth between Api in Berlin and the horrors he lived through every day, and me and my growing up with him, and also then researching into his life. So I was just thinking of something else, and now I've forgotten it. Um, um, but the writing process is really something that, where you grow into something, and the revision makes a huge difference. I think, as we all of us here who are writers know, that it's really revision, that nobody I have ever known just puts out a book first thing and that is it. I revised all my other books too, but nothing quite as radically as this one.
Gabriella, we do have some questions in the chat. Let's see. And some of these you may have already responded to, but I'll go ahead and read. Crystal said she would like to she's interested in what way your grandfather was involved with the Nazi Party.
Yeah, that's a good question. I could not find, my mother was already dead when I was writing that, and I had no other living relatives at all. So I couldn't ask anyone. And in a way, although I regretted that, I also knew my mother did not want to talk about that time. Whenever I would bring anything up, she did not want to talk about that. So I'm not sure that it would have helped if she had still been alive, that I would have loved to ask my grandfather, and I have no idea what he would have said. In the diary, he just rails against the Nazis, but that is 1945, right? Germany is clearly losing the war. Things are chaotic. I'm not sure how much one can go by that. He did not seem to, from all these documents I found, these volumes, I saw no evidence of that he had been active in any way in the party, except that he was part of the Nazi Medical Association. But what I don't know is, how did he react when at Kristallnacht, for example, right? When Jewish businesses were destroyed. Later on, when Jews weren't allowed into movie houses or restaurants and so on. How did he react? I do not know that. I have letters of his from the 20s and 30s. No, very few from the 30s, actually, mainly from the 20s. And of course, that was before. But I don't really have any evidence, except that in the diary, he keeps asserting that he had never done anything to harm anyone. That goes only so far, right, in that situation. I did have one letter from a Jewish colleague who went to South America, who fled during the Nazi period. And he wrote that except for him and a few members of his family that are left in Berlin, he is not talking to anyone. So I assume by writing to him, my grandfather was, maybe even helped him. I don't know. The denazification document, which in itself has to be taken with a grain of salt. I guess you're all familiar with the denazification. After the war, every member of the Nazi party had to be denazified. And you had to give testimonies, and they asked other people and so on. And my grandfather's is exonerated, which I found out later on doesn't happen very often. Most of them are called Mitläufer, what you call that? German speakers here, Mitläufer, followers, kind of, what do you call it? Pardon?
A collaborator?
No, it's not as much. It's running along.
Running along, yeah.
But there's an English word, and I can't think of it right now. But most of them, people I've talked to and so on, were classified as Mitläufer, not as exonerated. I don't know why he got that. That could have been a total fluke, or who knows, right?
A couple of the questions here, I think you may have already answered. Oh, sorry.
But it still is the question, how did he react to this? And I think consciously he hasn't ever hurt anyone. And one patient, a Jewish patient, said he kept treating her. So he kept treating Jewish patients during the 30s and 40s. I don't know how many, I don't know, anything more than this sort of fragmentary information. And then I, of course, go on that he had always been a very moral and very religious man and so on. But again, there's no really one definite answer.
I'm going to try to combine some of these. I'm going a little bit out of order for the folks that are here. I think you already responded to the fact that you don't really know why he joined the party. That was one of them.
Well, I think it was a combination of that many people of his, he was a conservative. And he was probably, although he did not, I don't have written evidence of that, he was probably afraid of the communists. That was the big scare in those days, that the communists would take over, that there would be a revolution in Germany and the communists would take over. And so, and the Weimar Republic, as well-meaning as they were Germany's first democracy. They really didn't have the wherewithal to assert themselves. Ironically, their flag, which is the German flag that we have now, which is also was the flag of the 1848 of the idealistic revolutionaries of 1848, the black, schwarz-rot-gold, black, red, yellow, or gold flag, that is never in evidence when you see pictures. It's either the old flag of the empire, the black and white flag of the empire, although the emperor was of course gone, long gone, or the Nazi flag. They couldn't even get their own flag acknowledged. So they did not, and there were oodles of elections, none of them conclusive. There was constant turmoil in the streets. And he probably was very afraid of the communist thing. Ironically, later on, as devoted as the United States and other folks were to denazify everyone, if you were a scientist and worked on any kind of rocket or anything, you've heard of the red, what is it called? The red line, the red line. those folks were taken, even though they were could have been the most ardent Nazis. Nobody cared as long as they were helping in the race again against the Soviets, right? The communist scare was there again. And they hoped that these German scientists, who in many areas were pretty advanced, would help the cause. So the Red Line actually, the West helped these folks escape, and so that they could use their science. So I think the fear of communism, the fear of just no law and order, that there was nobody who could impose himself. And Hitler, if you read his early speeches, you wouldn't think it's Hitler. You know, he talks about how he only wants peace, not only for Germany, but for the world, and how he wants to bring back the old Christian values and family values, just all those things my grandfather loved. He would talk about that, and he would even end his speeches with amen in this early days, you know, before he became chancellor and so on. So this is not to say that he hadn't written Mein Kampf in 1925, and more astute people and more politically engaged people, my grandfather wasn't really very politically interested, could have known and should have known what Hitler was all about. But I think I assumed he just clung to the hope that here was a man strong enough to stand up against the communists, and also strong enough to stand up against all the warring forces that he experienced in Berlin. The streets were constantly unsafe. And that he thought this was the best hope for the country. That is but it's not anything I can say for sure, but that seems the most likely explanation.
This is a question about zeitgeist. What insights did you get into the zeitgeist? What can be gleaned on the mindset of your grandfather and the people he was surrounded by during the time covered by the diaries?
Sorry, I was looking at that chat that me flashed up, so I'm sorry I missed that. Could you say that again?
So what insights did you get into the zeitgeist, and what can be gleaned on the mindset of your grandfather and the people he was surrounded by during the time covered by the diaries?
Well, the one area that I was really most troubled with, and I couldn't pinpoint, was when you talk of zeitgeist, one thing people will say that there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Germany, not just in Germany, but in Europe altogether, in England certainly too. And in how much was he part of that? He never mentions anything about the Jews. He doesn't mention anything about the Holocaust. I do not know to what extent he knew, but one assumes he must have known something. But I do not know. And that is another area that's much contested, right? How much did people know? Clearly, people who were near any of the concentration camps knew what was going on, or knew some of what was going on. Mm-hmm. But I think, again, my guess here is that he stuck his head in the sand, that he just didn't want to know. That he did what so many do, and what I could imagine myself doing, that you just focus on your own life, on your own family, on your own work, and do not really try to, find out too much about anything else. And, and there clearly is a guilt and a responsibility there. There's no question. But it's one that hits all of us, right? Because we are all turning a blind eye at times to what's going on, or have, or so. And this is maybe encouraging us not to do it as much, to try to be more involved. And I'm myself not a very political person, and so I think it's one of the big questions of our time as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any stories about your grandfather's experience as a doctor in Berlin in 1945?
Oh yeah, I mean, he will describe in great detail, how there would be 100 wounded with only 2 doctors there to help, and how the aprons of the doctors were covered in blood, and it was just, and without water and without sanitation. I mean, it was really hard to keep the wounded even healthy. Typhoid and diphtheria were just raging at the time.
Mhm.
The flies were everywhere because of the corpses. The place really stank of corpses, the dead people, dead horses. um, there was just vermin everywhere. There was no way of sanitizing anything. There was so little he could do, and he was frustrated. He worked, from early in the morning till late at night on trying to make the patients more comfortable, but there was very little they could do for quite a while. The Soviets, when they came, were trying, they immediately set up, all the doctors had to be part of meetings, regular meetings about the spread of typhoid and other things. Um, but there was very little that could be done before, without the sanitation and without windows. You couldn't keep anything out. It was really hard. And he will describe that, and he will describe go walking around the streets, and what he found, finding an old woman kind of broken down. She was obviously a refugee, and she was too weak to go on, and all he could do was share his dry bread with her, and she wouldn't even have the strength to pick it up. But the places where he worked were totally overcrowded, that you couldn't, the, so to speak, lucky ones who were in there, for whom not much could be done. But there were even worse situations of all the people just outside. The Landwehrkanal, which is nearby too, was just covered in corpses and stank of corpses. And it, it was just a really nightmare scenario.
Uh, Here's another one about your grandpa. Did what you learned about your grandpa change anything about how you felt about him?
No, because when the child in me still reacts the same way. That the one thing maybe that did change was that for me, who had been sort of moved around a lot in kinder transports and everything, he was sort of the image of stability and safety. And now I saw him at the brink of his own collapse. He didn't trust, he couldn't make any decisions anymore. He didn't trust himself in anything. Whenever he decided something, he immediately revoked it because he thought, I'm never going to do the right thing. He was sick himself. He was really, he struggled for a long time with wanting to commit suicide. And he's a very religious man for whom that was really, and he consulted with ministers, and of course they all told him, you cannot do this. But he kept saying, I wish only an end. I mean, I can't go on like this. And it is strange for the child in me to see the grandfather who was, that pillar of strength for me, to see him brought so low himself.
Sure. And that kind of probably responds to a question about how he could live and others lived with the traumatic things that they saw and what might be today diagnosed as PTSD. Um,
Yes, I was wondering about that. I did not feel that. He was, whenever he came into the room, when from his praxis, when he took a break and he came, there was always smiles and laughter, and he brought life into things. Uh, I never had the feeling that he was depressed, or it must have taken some toll. Um, But I think maybe he was also just trying to forget all that, and he never talked about it. And he was really a great source of joy uh, for me growing up. But that is strange. Yeah, I wonder. I do not know. He died, 9 years after 45, so he did not live that long beyond um, that. So it clearly had taken its toll.
There are other comments in here, but not really questions per se. Somebody refers to the book by Eric Larson, In the Garden of the Beasts.
Yes, 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 I have.
And yeah, as
I
being
mean, that's the sort of glitzy part of the Nazi world.
yeah.
So it sounds to me, Dr. Robinson, like maybe he was trying to protect you and the family from that history a little bit. At least he's a source of joy, but he internally struggled. And when you came in the room, you were his source of joy, it sounds like. And maybe he was trying to protect you. Do you feel, was there, in terms of the families in the area at that time, was there any sense that they knew who were former party members? Was there any, within the community, were there any types of encampments where there were former party members and not party members? How was that interrelationship among families in the community? Or was a lot of that just not known?
I think many, by the way, call me Gabrielle, but I think that's a very insightful statement to get to the first thing and then to the other one, which I don't have a really direct answer to. Yes, I mean, even in the diary, he kept saying about me, he was so concerned. He said, she needs sunshine to thrive, and I think he knew that, and he wanted to provide that kind of sunshine for me. And probably his nature was also sunny in some ways. But as to the other thing, I think from what I gather is that people, even who were members of the Nazi Party, would never admit it. Right afterwards, suddenly there were no Nazis anymore. Everybody would kind of deny having played any kind of active part and so on, unless they were, in the Nuremberg trials or in some other legal trouble. So certainly in the 50s, people just tried to forget. But there's some other thing about Germany. By the way, there's a book that came out recently called Learning from the Germans, and that which makes all of us German inclined people quite, it's a whole new way. Usually Germans are associated with Hitler. When I first was a grad student at Columbia, a fellow student, a Jewish fellow student, picked me up, wanted to pick me up and invite me out, but his opening line was, "So you've made soap out of my aunt." And I was just horrified and ran away. But even then, I did not confront my own past. But I'm getting what was on before. There was some point I was trying to get to.
Learning from the Germans, is that Susan?
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Because in the 50s and early 60s, there still was the silence, right? We didn't play the national anthem. We didn't talk about the Nazi period as if it had never, we behaved as if it had never happened. But that all changed in the 60s and pretty dramatically. And that's partly of the learning from the thanks Travis, of the learning from the Germans, that they began to face their past, to acknowledge, to reckon, to do reparations, to rebuild synagogues, to re-invite Jewish people back. And a lot of Jewish folks now live in Berlin, for example, again. And I always like to use the example of the, you probably have heard of that, the Stolpersteine. Is that something you know what that is? Stolperstein means stumbling stones in German. And if you go to Berlin, but even other towns and cities, you will see these bronze, slightly raised round stones in front of houses from where a Jewish family had been taken to a concentration camp. And they will give the date and the name of the people. And you're supposed to stumble over that in your daily routine. You know, this is part of the reckoning and the acknowledging that you go about your life, but you're supposed to remember, wow, this wasn't that long ago, and this is what happened right here in front of this house. So they've done a lot, and that is that book. It's written, I think, by an American called Learning from the Germans, in terms of America's past with racism and slavery and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and all those things. Because never, even when we were silent, there were never any monuments to any Nazi person or any general who fought in the war. There's nothing on that.
Well, I have an extensive collection of small town history books from Germany. And
Yes.
some of them touch about the Jewish populations and the Stolpersteine and the Jewish cemeteries, which are still all there. And not all of them, but a lot of them are still there.
A lot of them are there.
Yeah, and it's kind of like if you are a Democrat or Republican now, lots of people are members of the party. And then if one party commits atrocities, they don't tell you how many people they kill and what they do. I don't think it was known that much to the general public at the time, especially not in smaller towns. They knew something was going on, but not the extent. So a lot of them joined the party for business advantages. You know, being a member of the party would get you something, but you're not really killing people, and you don't have any intentions of ever killing anyone. And it's just like now, you know, we've seen with this whole mask thing, how easy it is to intimidate people under the fear of death. You know, you can't do this, you can't do this, you get locked up in your house. It's the same thing. It's the same psychology where they tell you about some evil and then you go along with it for fear, because if you don't go along with it, you might get shot or you might lose your job and all this other stuff. And people, I have found, are not all Schindlers. Very few of them are. Most of them are cowards. And not anything to say about your grandfather, but some people also helped a lot of Jewish people, like an underground type thing. We had like a firster, like a forest worker, who hid the Jewish family in the woods, and they sold them the property. He sold their property for them and got them tickets to come to America. And all the time, you know, the kids did. Nobody knew this till the Jewish family came back from New York and just thanked the guy, like probably in the 70s, they came down. And so it's stuff like that, you know, the guy wasn't talking about it. Nobody would, you know, brag about this stuff. And probably the same way they don't brag about being in part of something really bad. And it's not, you know, I think in some ways people think, oh, they're all monsters, but I don't think so. I think mostly what it was is the SS, and I can really see how people get involved with going along with a political movement because they get fired up, or, you know, they believe in it, or they have personal advantages. And then when you look at the whole World War II Treaty of Versailles, everybody was starving. So they needed, you know, from what I can read in history is that this Second World War was basically built into the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles. Because like if people are starving and then you promise them some kind of a better life, then they'll go with it because it's a good thing. You know, they don't tell you about all the other people they're going to kill and all this other stuff they're going to do. So I don't know. But I've tried, like in a small town, like as far as I can tell, my parents my parents were too young and my grandparents were too old to be in the war. So in that respect, I guess we were fortunate that nobody was directly the right age. And sometimes it's luck, you know. But from what I can tell, there weren't too many party members in any town. There was just like a few. And it was a lot of times it was the ones that were very overly zealous were the lower elements of society that rose up because that gave them some kind of power, you know.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm going to look up Mitläufer. It doesn't leave me because that's in a way what you are talking about too.
Yeah, it's
I will look. I don't know why it just.
I think they call them traveler.
Yes.
Traveler.
Pardon me. What is it called? Something traveler, right?
Yeah. But anyway, it's like, yeah. But yeah, I just read that Whitaker Chambers book, and that's how they judged the communists, whether they were Mitläufer or whether they were actually involved, you know, whether they would be prosecuting them. Yeah, so I've tried in the town. I said, there's got to have been somebody been a Nazi in this town, and nobody will admit to it, you know. So the town I'm from is probably only, at the time, was like 3,000 people. And then with all the refugees coming from the east, it's pretty much double in size now. But it's hard to find anyone. Like some of my grandmother's uncle was in the Nazi party, but he wasn't the same thing. It was like he had people testify for him after the war, like Jewish people and prisoners of war, you know, that he was just good to them, you know. But
Janet, is there other, you know, since we're running out of time, is there other people who
there may be others? Let's see if we have any other questions here. Let's go ahead and put them in the chat if you have any other questions. I'm gonna scroll back here for a minute.
Somebody, Melinda Heinrichs asked if you had watched Sharite at War on Netflix.
Had watched what? Pardon me?
Sharite at War. Maybe Melinda can ask verbally.
What is that? No. Yeah. I'm going to put my email in the chat. So in case there's something that you guys want to talk about or so, you know, feel free to contact me. Okay, so yeah, let her talk. I don't know what, I'm not sure I know what she's talking about.
I don't know.
There we go. So it's, hi, this is Melinda. Thanks for your presentation tonight. So it's Charité at War.
Yes,
so it's the hospital here. Yeah.
That. Right.
Yes. I was just curious, and yeah, not that you were living then and know. Oh yeah, it's so accurate. I was just curious.
No, I don't know, but you know, I watched it because my grandfather worked with Sauerbruch and knew him, and you know, I was interested in that, you know, and I think they're going to have another, my German friends tell me there's going to be another installment of that. It's the history of the Charité, which is still, you know, this is the Navalny, that's where he was when he was recovering from the poisoning. He was at the Charité. It's still one of the best hospitals in Germany. And this is under Sauerbruch, who played a bit of an ambiguous role in a way. He denounced Hitler, but he also went along. He mainly wanted to keep his hospital going. And, you know, with all the Jewish doctors who had left, there was, you know, it was really hard. And he tried to kind of steer a course. And I think that TV thing, Melinda, is really dealing with the difficult path and the maybe slightly ambiguous path he had to take to keep that place alive under Hitler. But it's a great show, actually. Did you like it?
I think she's muted now.
Oh, okay. She can't hear then either? No.
Here, but I have to
Yeah.
unmute.
Yes, I find it enjoyable, but it's, you know, it's kind of it's disturbing also, just, you know, just everything that's going on in society, you know, the good guys, the bad guys, and everyone in between. There's just, you know, a sense of unease. And anyway, thanks for answering the question.
Yes, and as Sebastian says, that's the hospital that's associated with the university. That's why my grandfather studied there. And then after the war, after the First World War, he also did operations there occasionally. And then, you know, he worked there again with Sauerbruch, who was sort of in charge for a while of the whole medical aspect of Berlin.
One of the things that came to mind, just this is me talking, not reading, is that, you know, my uncles that were in World War II here from the United States, they didn't talk about it either. They didn't. So I kind of wonder if it was, well, I mean, I guess it certainly is different perspective, but if that was that era too, that put people in the, you know, that they knew that they felt they had to come back into society, and, you know, how they dealt with it, I don't know. Because if you ever read Band of Brothers, that was what my uncle was, a medic, and he was D-Day plus something, and I don't know, and he was in the Battle of the Bulge, and I know he saw some tough things too. And
Yeah.
I just wonder, you know, if they had a diagnosis of PTSD back then, would there have just been so many?
Well, and you know, the Vietnam vets, right, came back and did not talk about what they had gone through. I think, you know, it's one way of, you know, suppression is one way of trying to deal with these traumas.
Ruth, did you have a question?
Hello, Ruth. Good to see you.
Open you up here. Ruth, you're I'm allowing you to unmute if you'd like to. Let me see if I can- There you go.
There
you
Hi,
go.
Ruth. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
It's been quite a
such
while,
long
hasn't
time.
it? Yes.
And I'm so glad you came. And to see you again after so many years.
You were probably muted. I said that before when at the beginning you were briefly on, and I was so excited. Oh, there's Ruth. I haven't seen her in so long.
I just wanted to add one thing. My grandmother lived in Garmisch and was a friend of Richard Strauss. And Richard Strauss was a member of the party. And the reason was because he wanted to make music. And he wanted to keep on conducting the opera. And they would have taken it away from him if he wouldn't have been a member of the party. So many of them just didn't have a choice.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I mean, and you know, teachers and
this is the one thing that really has been sticking in my mind, is that Hitler took away our freedom of speech. We could no longer speak, and this is one thing here in the US, we have to really defend it. Our freedom of speech.
Yes, and our free, and you know, our willingness to go along with what's real and not made up.
Anyway,
And I
Greeting.
just have a question to all of you. If do you get together among yourselves as the German IGHS, or only for things like this?
We do monthly have in the normal world before the pandemic, we get together in person and we have a dinner at the Athenaeum, the Ratskeller, downtown. And then we have a meeting and then we have dinner and then the Stammtisch presentation. So it's, you know, it's monthly, but I'm not sure that that's all for some of these folks that are, you know, and this is open to members and non-members, I should say, can come
Yeah.
to presentations.
Oh, that's nice. By the way, is it still saying Athenaeum or is it saying Deutsches Haus again?
It says Das Deutsches Haus. Hey,
It
Bill,
does. Well,
Miss-
that's,
that?
yeah,
Bill, you
because
want
that wasn't true for a long time, right?
Well, let me clarify that.
Yes, you are the expert on
On
that.
George Washington's birthday of 1918, the Turnverein changed the name of its building from Das Deutsche Haus to the Athenaeum. The name of the building is still Athenaeum. However, the Indiana German Heritage Society initiated remembering the name by replicating in half scale the original lintel plaque, which said Das Deutsche Haus. So that is now mounted on the front of the building under and that's the cast metal, under the stone plaque that says Athenaeum. So the building is still Athenaeum, which a lot of people cannot pronounce. They cannot pronounce Athenaeum. And, but we still remember the original name of over 100 years ago, Das Deutsche Haus, which is right above the archway, or right
Okay.
inside the archway of the main entrance. So
Okay, interesting. Thank you for that expert. I always thought that they had to take it off in 1917 when the United States joined the war, that they got rid of the German
well,
language on that building, but that may not be correct then.
no, 1918 is when well, really, it was a culture war. You know, they use that term now. There was a culture war in 1918, especially 18, when they really tightened the screws. And you had by laws as well as by, well, public opinion and bullying, declared war on German language and as Kurt Vonnegut says, a hatred of everything German. In the United States. So it was a type of forced assimilation. Now they talk about forced assimilation, you know, with other groups, and that was what was happening here because it destroyed German language as a public language. And as a our stupid legislatures, they passed a law after the war, in 1919, passed a law banning the teaching of German in schools. The war is over. It's the residual hatred. So that was pretty much the forced assimilation and the death of public German identity and culture and language.
Yeah.
Because most of the newspapers then ended with that.
I once talked to the father, long dead now, of the mayor of Mishawaka, Mr. Beuter, and he remembers as a young man that, you know, Turner Hall was sort of the place to go to dance and to do things. And then with World War I, all that was closed down, and he didn't even dare say that he was German, and he wouldn't speak the language anymore. because he would be ostracized. And he was by that time a man in his 90s. He was still hurting from that experience.
There was a lot of intimidation and bullying.
Yeah.
And then it was backed up by our own government, because we had these things called councils of defense. And what they did is they spied and intimidated. So it was it, and no one's really, most of the people don't understand that. When I see the phrase anti-German sentiment, well, now that I've done more research, I don't use that phrase. That whitewashes the whole thing. It really doesn't express what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
Anti-German sentiment. I don't use that anymore.
Well, now there's a book, Learning from the Germans, right?
Right. So, Janet, are there more questions that came in? People typing in through the chat?
Sorry, I was not unmuted myself. Just comments about the German language newspapers being forced to provide translations of articles. We do know that happened here in Indianapolis and Indiana, certainly. And that was definitely, and it talks about the death of the German American newspapers, which
Yes.
Bill Selm has been really imperative in helping Indiana see what needs to be remembered here in the state of Indiana. And that was another marker. I was trying to dig up a picture of Das Deutsche Haus, and I may have it, the sign, in a minute. Let me see if I've got any other questions here.
No, South Bend had German newspapers.
Yeah. Bill
Bill
knows about this stuff too. He can probably, you want to expound a little bit on that?
Well, there are German language newspapers all over the country, and Indianapolis had a series of them. Major one was at the end was the Indiana Tribune, but there were German language newspapers throughout, and they were essentially put out of business because the German language newspapers then had to publish translation of all their articles, and then of course there were restrictions on going through the mail. So it was a very tight suppression of German language, and then, as Kurt Vonnegut said, and he says it the best, I think, a hatred of all things German, and that's what it was. It was a very, very nasty, broad brush that everything was painted with, and it was just devastating. It was. And that's the destruction of the
okay.
culture.
Janet, this is how it looks now?
Yes.
Yes, this is a picture. I did pull it up. This is the new sign.
That's beautiful, yeah.
This is our home. Bill, you might put a plug in for the for us if you'd like.
We had a nice committee of people with Kent Robinson and Ron Flick and Jim Keenley on the committee to get this done. So that's 14 feet long, and fits into the doorway right below where the original one was. I'm sorry, that's 7 feet. The original was 14, so it's exactly half scale. And I think it looks great.
It looks beautiful, yes.
Yeah. And we only had one photograph to base that on, just one. And,
no, that's very well done. Looks lovely.
It's really perfection, and that's the best place for it.
Mm-hmm.
Janet, are there any other questions?
And I have to get back to where I can see them. Travis, do you see any? You might look, because I'm going to get
Thanks for bringing that picture up, Janet. That was very timely.
to dig it up off our Facebook page.
And
Just
it
getting a
has
lot of
been-
thank you and congratulations for a great talk. So that's what we're getting.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being there and being patient all this while. And I would love to have heard from every one of you about something, but maybe another time we can all meet at the Deutsche Haus.
That would be wonderful.
Yes, it would.
Yeah. Greetings to your husband.
Yes, Bruce, really good to see you, and you're looking
Yeah.
well.
I'm okay. I'm a few years older than you are, but I'm doing okay.
Great, great. Well, you've been a force in this whole enterprise for a long, long time.
Right.
She is still the guiding light of the Indiana German Heritage Society.
Yes.
And this is another positive of the pandemic. It has given us a chance to meet with Ruth as well and see her and hear from her at times, and that's a wonderful thing.
Bill, somebody asked about the next presentation. Do you want to give a brief summary on the upcoming presentations before we log off?
Yes, the next presentation, next Stammtisch, will be the 9th of June. And our presenter is Ron Fleck. Ron is an architect and a native of Jasper, Indiana, in God's country, Du Bois County. And so Ron is going to report on this German monument preservation efforts in Du Bois County. And he has had, as an active participant on a number of those projects. So we'll get the insider's view on restoration of those buildings. So I think that's about it for this evening. It's close to 9 o'clock. I want to thank everybody. Well, first of all, our presenter, that was wonderful, Gabriela. Thank you so very much. It was.
Thank you.
I'm applauding.
But I also want to thank everyone for being here and contributing. And it was really nice to at least see your names. I see somebody is called Schönfeld. That was the name of my stepfather.
All right. Well, let's call it an evening. Good night, everyone. Gute Nacht. Auf Wiedersehen. Auf Wiederhören.
Gute Nacht, ja.
Bis zum nächsten
All the
Mal.
best. Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Same.
Bye-bye.